The Murder of Rashawn Brazell, a True Crime. Deep Dive. In the early months of 2005, New York City was still shaking off winter when one of its most haunting and heartbreaking murder cases began to unfold. It's a story that stretches nearly 2 decades, involving cold case detectives, subway tunnels, rare evidence prototypes, courtroom drama, and a family's tireless battle to keep their son's name alive. The victim at the center of this case was 19-year-old Rashawn Brazell, a young man whose life was filled with promise, warmth, and community love. But what happened to him on Valentine's Day in 2005 became one of NYC's most disturbing unsolved homicides, a case that many believe never received the attention it deserved, largely because of who Rashawn was, a young black bisexual man from Brooklyn. This is a deep dive into the murder of Rashawn Brazell, a case marked by grief, mystery, allegations of investigative bias, and a still open question: who killed Rashawn? Who was Rashawn Brazell? To understand the case, you first need to understand the person. Rashawn was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Friends and family describe him as funny, gentle, and bright, someone who loved to cook and dreamed of a future in fashion or hospitality. He was the type of young man who would brighten a room just by being in it, and he was deeply connected to his family, especially his mother, Desiree. He wasn't someone who lived a high-risk lifestyle. He wasn't in trouble, he wasn't involved in gangs, and he wasn't known to have enemies. His mother said he was a homebody who loved talking with her, helping neighbors, and spending time with his sisters and friends. He was also open about being bisexual. In later years, this detail would become extremely important in discussions about the investigation and media coverage, because many activists felt that Rashawn's identity contributed to the lack of urgency around solving his murder. The day, everything changed. February 14th, 2005. On Valentine's Day, around 7:30 in the morning, someone rang the buzzer at Rashawn's home in Bushwick. He was living with his mother at the time. She later recalled that he seemed calm and casual, as if he knew exactly who he was meeting. He told her he was heading out to meet his accountant, and then planned to meet her for lunch later that day in Manhattan. This was normal. Rashawn was responsible about his appointments and regularly went out for errands. Surveillance and witness accounts later suggested that he left the apartment with a man and the two entered the subway at the Gates Avenue station. What happened after that remains one of the biggest mysteries in the case, because Rashawn was never seen alive again. The first discovery. Inside the subway system. 3 days later, on February 17th, transit workers were inspecting the subway tunnels on the A line between the Nostrand Avenue and Franklin Avenue stations in Brooklyn. This is an area of restricted access. Dark tunnels, train traffic, and maintenance routes that are not open to the public. In that tunnel, workers found double-bagged trash bags close to the tracks. Inside, they found human remains. Police were called immediately. Also near the bags was an item that would become one of the most unusual and potentially significant pieces of evidence in the entire case: a specialized Rooster brand tool bag. At the time, the MTA stated that only around 15 prototype tool bags of that kind had ever been produced. The presence of such a unique item sparked early theories that the killer might have had subway access, transit employment, or familiarity with the underground system. 2 days later, fingerprint analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Rashawn Brazell. The second discovery, a week later. On February 23rd-24th, more of Rashawn's remains were found at a Brooklyn recycling plant in Greenpoint, also double-bagged in trash bags. The pattern of disposal, the bags, and the logistics strongly suggested that whoever did this had meticulous planning, physical strength, and enough confidence to move through different parts of the city without detection. The medical examiner's office eventually determined that Rashawn had been strangled before the dismemberment occurred. This meant the killer had taken him alive somewhere private, murdered him, and then transported him. From the very beginning, investigators knew this wasn't the work of someone acting impulsively. This was organized, deliberate, and chillingly methodical. A complex crime scene and early theories. Immediately, the NYPD faced a difficult and frustrating puzzle. The subway tunnels, with their constant vibration, dust, and heavy traffic, made it incredibly hard to retrieve trace evidence. The presence of that rare tool bag also opened a massive door of speculation. Was the killer a subway employee? Was he a contractor? Did he have access to the tunnels? Or did he simply steal the bag or acquire it secondhand? Investigators were careful not to jump to conclusions, but the bag remained one of the strongest clues they had. At the same time, because the remains were discovered in two completely separate locations, a subway tunnel and a recycling center, detectives considered whether the killer intentionally separated evidence to complicate the investigation. Media coverage claims of bias. Even though the case was gruesome and unusual, it didn't attract the level of ongoing media attention that similar murder cases often receive. Family members, activists, and members of New York's Black LGBTQ+ community argued that the lack of media urgency reflected a broader problem. Cases involving young, queer Black men often don't receive the same spotlight as others. Rashawn's case became a rallying point for discussions about violence against LGBTQ+ people of color and disparities in how police and media treat their disappearances and murders. Despite coverage on America's Most Wanted and some local press, the story faded from the headlines more quickly than anyone expected. The case goes cold for over a decade. For years, investigators followed leads, re-interviewed individuals who knew Rashawn, and tried to trace the unusual tool bag, but nothing broke the case open. The investigation remained technically active, but without any clear suspects or forensic breakthroughs, the trail went cold. His mother, Desiree, refused to let her son be forgotten. She pushed community leaders, spoke at events, contacted reporters, and advocated relentlessly. A break in the case, the arrest of Kwahuru Govan, in 2017, 12 years after Rashawn's murder, authorities made a dramatic announcement. Police had arrested Kwahuru Govan, a man in his 30s who grew up in Brooklyn near Rashawn's family. Govan was already in custody in Florida on unrelated charges, but he had also been linked by DNA to the 2004 murder of 17-year-old Sharabia Thomas, another Brooklyn teen who was kidnapped, strangled, and left in bags. Parallels between the two murders were alarming. Both victims were young. Both were strangled. Both were dismembered or placed in bags. Both were from Brooklyn neighborhoods near where Govan lived. These similarities caused investigators to take a hard look at Govan for Rashawn's unsolved killing. Courtroom drama, explosive behavior. When Govan was brought back to New York and charged with Rashawn's murder, the courtroom scenes became chaotic. During hearings, he frequently shouted at the judge, cursed at prosecutors, and insisted he was being framed. In one outburst, when prosecutors described the dismemberment, Govan yelled, "I can't even dissect a frog!" His behavior made headlines, but behavior alone is not evidence. Family members said they did know Govan, or believed he knew Rashawn, though Govan insisted he had no connection to the family at all. Police alleged that Govan had acted suspiciously in early interviews and changed his story multiple times, fueling their suspicions. But under the surface, prosecutors had a problem: why the charges were dropped. Even with circumstantial similarities and disturbing patterns, prosecutors eventually made a decision that shocked many. They dropped the murder charges against Govan in the Brazell case. Why? Because they concluded that they didn't have enough evidence to secure a conviction. It wasn't that they believed he was innocent. It was that the evidence tying him specifically to Rashawn's death was not solid enough. And if they went to trial and lost, double jeopardy laws would prevent them from ever charging him again. Meanwhile, Govan was convicted in the Sharabia Thomas murder, receiving 25 years to life for that case. But for Rashawn, justice remained out of reach. The case today, still unsolved. As of now, the murder of Rashawn Brazell remains officially unsolved. There has been no trial, no conviction, no definitive suspect. Detectives still consider it an active case, but no major updates have been released in recent years. The tool bag remains one of the most intriguing clues, yet it never led to a conclusive breakthrough. Rashawn's legacy. His family's fight for answers. Despite the lack of resolution, Rashawn's name lives on through activism, community work, and a scholarship program called the Rashawn Brazell Memorial Scholarship, created to support students from marginalized backgrounds and encourage work against violence, discrimination, and intolerance. His mother has said repeatedly that she will never stop fighting for her son, and for other families whose loved ones were taken without closure. Documentarians, journalists, and activists have continued to revisit the case, hoping that renewed attention might bring forward new leads. Final thoughts. The murder of Rashawn Brazell is one of those cases that stays with you long after you learn about it. Not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the silence that followed and the mother who refused to let her child vanish from public memory. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. Whose stories get prioritized in the media? How do marginalized identities impact the urgency of an investigation? And how many cases like Rashawn's are still out there, unsolved and largely forgotten? Rashawn was a son, a friend, a dreamer, a young man with a future. He deserved far more than what happened to him, and he deserves justice.